Alright, hello everyone, welcome back to another API review. So today we are continuing more or less where we left off. I think Miriam had something she wanted to go over from last time.
Yes.
Which issue was that? Do you remember?
First one.
Okay, so you marked it again then?
Yeah, I just marked it again. It was a follow-up feedback after we got approval on the API. If you go to the comment section, the last comment kind of covers what we talked about, what David recommended afterwards is basically to have memory cache implement something like iMemory cache has stats or statistics as proposed. Let me see. I'm just gonna see if I have a draft here. I can paste the proper, like the complete API, but basically we would have an interface called, let's say, iMemory cache has statistics that has get current statistics, and then memory cache would implement it.
So how is this better than just adding the API to the class?
So last time we added to the class, it will be for this specific class, I mean the concrete class. But if anybody using the main interface iMemory cache,
yeah,
they will not be able to reach this the stats. So it has to be abstracted to the interface.
Yeah.
Do we have anybody who does that?
That's a good question.
And then maybe another like small thing would be that they would I guess like if they wanted to access it via an interface, they like with the memory cache, they would cast it to memory cache, but maybe if I don't know, like that would be like a side benefit, but no, that's not, nobody necessarily asked for.
I mean, in general, from a pattern standpoint, I'm not a fan of like having one interface per future API additions, because then you have all permutations of possible, implementations. Like if you want to go down the path on keeping the interfaces, I would rather have like iMemory cache 2, iMemory cache 3, and iMemory cache 4, and then just have them always derive from the previous one, so that you can DI just the latest version and then get all the features, rather than DIing now 4 different features because you need statistics and you need the other thing that we added and then the other thing that we added, and then it becomes a huge mess over time. But I would also say, like, unless there's evidence that anybody needs the interface, I would just leave the interfaces behind and just evolve the classes.
So basically just to keep it as is and see if someone asks for the interface.
I mean, if David has an implementation ASP.NET already that requires the interfaces, then yeah, let's do it. But I'm not, I mean, unless there is such a thing, I would say I'd rather leave the interfaces behind.
Okay, yeah, I mean...
Yeah, we would need, it's kind of like two sides are needed here. In order for us to do this, we would have to have two sides, right? One is other people who implement iMemory cache, which I'm pretty sure that's just a given. There are other people that implement iMemory cache. Like I know like Stack Exchange has in the past and stuff. But the other side is we would need a consumer who wants to get access to these statistics, but they don't know the implementation of which memory cache they're using. And that's the one that I question, that I don't know of who would need to get access to these statistics, but not know what the implementation of the underlying memory cache is.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
For example, like ASP.NET, I don't know of any reason why ASP.NET would need like the statistics on a cache, or somebody else provided the actual implementation. My understanding of like why we're adding this is for people who own the app, aka who own the cache, can get access to this stats so they can log it somewhere.
So then, are you saying we should add it to the interface, or are you saying that we don't have to?
I'm saying I agree with what you said, that we should wait until we have concrete evidence that we need to add it to an interface somehow here, whether that's DIM or new interfaces.
I would be fine with that too. But we wanted to discuss this anyways because it was a follow-up. I also inspected the implementation that are in memory cache and noticed there is this internal thing for testing, like a kind of logic for estimating the size. So it might make sense to, while we're at this API, just to add another field, call it estimated size, next to total hits and total requests, because that was one that we thought maybe in the future we can add. The estimated size for the cache.
Sorry, I missed the last part because I was typing notes. What do you mean by size?
Like the entry, like each the user would be able to kind of, when they enter their cache entry, to provide the entry size, and then like there's logic in the memory cache to kind of accumulate it, and every time you want to kind of remove the entry to reduce the estimated size. So it just makes sense to add another field here for the cache statistics, call it like estimated size, that will kind of increase or decrease based on if every time we remove from cache entry, remove a cache entry or add to it, it will update itself. I mean, since there's already logic in the memory cache implementation, we might as well just expose it.
Do we have one needs this now?
Yes, actually. There was a first party that asked for, they said it would be good to see estimated size.
So then the field would be estimated size? Or
I think, yeah, I was thinking maybe it could be called estimated size, if you agree with that.
and that would be a long, and that's the total number of bytes that we believe the cache occupies at this point?
Not necessarily bytes.
Not necessarily bytes. Right.
Like each entry has a size on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you get to define what the units are.
I see. So it's basically unit-less because it depends on the implementation of the cache.
The implementation of what's being cached. Because you can cache like any object, right?
Gotcha. Yep. So basically, I guess usage and implementation then.
Right.
Yeah, so long that, I mean, in that case, probably we should not add a unit to it. I was thinking if we think it's bytes, we should make it clear that it's bytes, but I guess this is what it is.
There's a recommendation to name it total estimated size, but I don't know if total would add.
Well, you have two other ones that are called total, right? So I guess that would make sense.
Is it estimated or it's just like the current size?
Yeah, I guess could be called size.
Yeah, we have current entry count, so we can have like current size for them.
Sure.
Yeah, I was about to ask the same thing. Like, I don't know where the estimation would come from. Like, if that's what the user passes in for the size, I mean, I guess the difference is between are the slots filled up or not, right? Right.
I think it can be called size, doesn't have to be estimated size.
Well, then total size or current
Sure.
size?
But yeah, I mean, Emo have a good point about like, does the size means what we occupying now, or just the size of the whole memory cache that we have now?
Like, I don't know. What do you mean? Can you repeat that one more time?
My understanding is the size we are talking about here is just the whole size we are allocating, including the entries that are already occupied and entries that's not occupied, right?
So like each time you add to the cache, and if you remove from the cache, you're removing a number from the size. So like, so if you remove an entry, you reduce the size from that entry from the total.
Okay, so the size is the size of the current entries.
Exactly.
So we have a current entry count already. So why we need the size then?
Because
Each entry has a size, so you could put
you
3
can?
things in that are each 5 big, and then you could put 2 more in that are each 10 big.
Yeah.
And so you would have.
I thought the entries have fixed size for all entry.
No, each entry has a size.
Yep, that has its own size.
Okay.
So cache entry has a size.
I mean, they might be fixed, but they're not uniform, right? That's the point, I think.
Mhm.
If you know
Right, it doesn't change. For each entry, it doesn't change on a given entry.
And I don't know if it matters, but I see that cache entry has a nullable size. Yeah.
But that means it's just defaulted, right? Presumably there is always a size associated with an entry, right?
Okay. Yeah. Just thought to bring it up, but I think so.
So one interesting thing about size is that memory cache has an options that you pass into it when you create it, and so you can give it like a size limit. And so if you didn't give it a size limit, we don't track the size today.
Oh.
So how are we going to handle that on statistics, where if somebody just creates a new memory cache and doesn't provide a size limit?
I guess that would mean that we count it as 0.
Yeah. So if it doesn't have a size limit. Yeah.
Right. Today, if you never put a size limit on the options when you created the memory cache, we don't track the size.
Right. Yes.
The cache.
That's true.
So I guess that would explain the estimation, right? Because it's like an estimate, provided that the user specified a size limit. If they didn't, then we don't know, right?
I wouldn't use that word. I would.
Fair enough.
I would almost make it nullable, I guess, since it's a nullable. On option, size limit is a nullable long.
Okay.
But is that useful then? Because basically you would now say as soon as you have one entry that doesn't have a size, then you cannot produce the value anymore at all, and then you probably
No, it's not based on entry. Like when you create the memory cache itself, you provide it in options.
Oh, that's what Mary meant. I thought this was like tied to the to the individual cache entry, but you're saying if you created the cache without any sort of size boundary, then we don't track anything ever. And so at that point, it would be reasonable to say, yeah, the statistics are also null because you asked us not to track it. That would make sense to me. So then my question is, how do we reconcile this total versus current? So do we call it total size? Do we call it current size? I mean, current seems to be implied anyway, right? Because, you know, every time you retrieve the statistics, you get, you know, the current statistics. So, you know, presumably, right?
I mean, it's tied to like the entries, right? So since we call it current entry count, I wouldn't call it total, right? Because basically current entry count, if you would add up all the sizes of all those entries, you should get this size that's coming out.
I mean,
So-
current entry size would also work for me.
Why
mean,
not just current size?
Also works, yeah. To me, it's just not clear what the difference between total and current is. Because we have some properties now that are called total request, total hits, and then we have current entry count and current size.
I don't remember why we used current from last week. But
When we said total, it was because like it was for the entire history of this memory cache instance. This is the total number of requests and the total number of hits.
Yeah.
And current is like a snapshot of
Right.
in its current state, this is the number of entry count.
Okay.
So which aligns to size, right?
I
So
see.
if we're following that same pattern, that's why I wouldn't call it total, because
Yes, makes
it
sense.
doesn't align to like the however long it's lived.
Because cache entries might disappear when the cache entry expires, versus the requests would always go up. There's no way they could go down.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. So current entry count and then current size. And then current size would be nullable.
Yes.
I think that makes sense to me, so let me just copy paste this in. So I commented out the interface and I explained why we're not fans of that. And then this is what it would look like, right?
I believe so. Yes. Yes.
All right. That's a comment.
Just like an implementation detail here is it's a coherent state that comes out of this, right? Like you shouldn't be able to, you shouldn't have, like if we're in the middle of adding a new entry, that entry not being on current entry count, but its size being added, or vice versa, right?
To mean that it's not like both of them either update or it might be that one gets updated depending on when you.
Right, we shouldn't be in that state. We shouldn't ever return a statistics that, since we were in the middle of adding an entry, it was in one of the counts, but not in the other.
Okay, but that's implementation. Yeah. Okay. Sure.
It is implementation, but it is, I think, part of the API contract, right? I mean, the whole point of a return a struct rather than exposing 4 individual properties directly on the cache is so that you can get snapshot semantics.
Okay. Okay.
I think we do the same thing in GC, I'm pretty sure, because otherwise you can't relate these entries. I should say these statistics to each other, right?
And I guess the same goes with total requests and total hits, because requests could be hits plus misses, right? So like.
Yep.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to extract some value of like how efficient is the cache, right, it's reasonable to divide one to the other, but then they better be, you know, in lockstep. Otherwise, it's not very useful.
Understood. Okay.
Alrighty, then I think we're done with this one.
Thank you.
And then Jeremy, you're up.
Okay, so basically last time we were here, we talked a little bit about right at the end of the discussion about codifying more of the requirements of a shape for the custom type marshalers into the attribute. And even though it'd be repeated information, it would provide a little bit more of a direct way for users to know what members they need to add, because they could say, I want to supply these features, or I want my marshaler to work in these directions. And then a code fix and a diagnostic could tell them exactly what information they need, or what members they need to provide to correctly provide a marshaler, instead of them providing what members they think they need. And then on the usage side, the marshaler detecting, okay, this marshaler only supports one direction. Anybody have any feedback on that?
You have to look at sample code. I'm still trying to parse what, like, because there's lots of words. I need to first understand what this thing actually does.
Yeah. Basically, these members on the enum will tie directly to specific members. So if you specify the in direction, you need specific members because you're providing a merge load that moves in. If you provide in plus a particular feature, then there are members that are required. We already have all of these requirements. This is just codifying those requirements into members we can put on the attribute.
So then why would we not just say, you know, you express that requirement by providing the methods, and if you don't provide them, then you don't have that feature?
It's hard for users to, it's a little bit difficult for users to discover exactly what methods they need for what features.
And so presumably some features require more than one member then, I guess.
Yes. Like if you look, the in direction requires only one member if you just specify in. But if you specify caller allocated buffer and in, then you need two members. If you specify two-stage marshaling and either the in or out direction, then there's members that are required for those.
If only we had a language feature that allows us to codify this.
Yes, if only we did that one worked in the type of scenario where we were using this. I would love to not have to deal with any of this shape stuff and just say, these are all of the interfaces, implement the ones that provide the features you desire. But it looks like interfaces on ref structs is not planned for anytime soon. At least according to the C# Lang planning milestones.
Yeah, I mean, that's a reasonable compromise. I completely understand the problem you're describing where it's already complicated enough. So having a list of features that you can have, I think is useful.
And we tried to name these features such that they would be applicable for any future martial arts we make as well that connect with other languages or other non-managed ecosystems, so that we wouldn't have to add. We tried to design it such that there's a little bit of future proofing in the design.
Unfortunately, Jeremy isn't here today. I think he would ask you why you don't have a 0 member for direction, because it basically means the default value is now invalid.
So we assign in the attribute, the default for direction is ref, which is in or out. And since this is read from an analyzer, we can pull that. We specifically did not put a none member for direction because not specifying a direction is an invalid state. It's an explicit error state, because if your marshaller doesn't support marshaling in or out, then it can't do anything.
Right. I mean, it just means when you have an uninitialized value, or I mean, you have an initialized value, but it's initialized to default. You just have no enum member that corresponds to that. Right. It just reads now as 0, right? Which might be confusing. I mean, you could have an invalid. You could have the 0 member to be named invalid, for example. In which case, it's pretty clear what what value you have.
Yeah, we could do that if that was preferred. We just didn't want to add a none because of martial that supports no direction means it doesn't do anything.
Yeah, let me take a quick look at the primary design guidelines if I can find them. I think there's guidance that says always have a 0 member, but I'm not entirely sure. God.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a guidance that says do provide a value of 0 on simple enums. Consider calling the value something like none. If such value is not appropriate for this particular enum, the most common default value for the enum should be assigned the underlying value of 0. You said you don't want to use 0 for that?
No, because the most common value is setting both in and out. And we were using it like a bit mask.
Oh, because it's a flex enum. I see.
Yeah.
Well, so the other guidance for flex enum is basically have one that is called none, and then you can just say none is not valid.
Okay.
I mean, that's kind of what we do in other things, right? I think there's some things in WinForms where if you said none, it's invalid. It's like, no, you need to decide which orientation this thing goes. There's such thing as
Okay.
no orientation.
Okay, I am fine with that. If that's the API guidelines. We had no use for it. We wanted to make it so you couldn't type something that wasn't supported.
Yeah.
But we can always throw maybe like editor browsable false on it, or yeah, editor like not browsable in the editor if that attribute works.
Yes, it should.
And then we
yeah.
can have an error out as well. So you really have to try to use it.
Yeah, I think editor browsable. At some point, I will remember what the enum member for editor browsable is.
I think it's editor browsable state never.
I always remember the word never, and I remember the enum name.
Yeah. We just gotta get that Roslyn feature that makes it so you don't have to actually type the name of the enum. You just put the value when it knows what the enum type is supposed to be based on target typing.
Yeah.
Probably never gonna happen, but it'd be really nice.
I think people are supportive of it. It's just work that never was scheduled, I think.
You can also just add a bunch of global using statics. That works as well. It's great for interop code.
I mean, I'm sure you're aware, but the initialization of the property does nothing.
The idea is the source generator, if you don't specify the property, we will pretend as though it's ref.
Right.
Because we're reading from the attribute data blob, basically from Roslyn. And then if someone uses reflection, the point of the initializer is to make the view from reflection match what the source generator implies as the default.
Yeah, if the reflection person is actually instantiating the attribute, right? If they just use custom attribute data, then they have the same problem that you have in Roslyn, where they just see the instantiation of the attribute, but they don't know.
Yeah, they'd have to actually instantiate the object.
It is kind of the problem of
initializer to kick in.
Of like relying on initialization and attributes, because you can't press that meaningfully.
Yeah, well, it's like through docs is the best you can do.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it looks reasonable to me. Anybody have any dissenting feedback? Oh, okay, then I guess. All right, one down. Is the other Jeremy here? I don't think he is, right? Maybe we reviewed this before. At least it looks familiar.
Right. We reviewed this before, and the feedback was, go talk to Maui and other people and determine if they'd actually use this. And basically everyone except for Image Sharp said that they would.
And so I guess the API proposal is still the same.
Yeah, it's still basically the same. It's we expose we expose some APIs on the existing system drawing color and system Windows media color APIs that allow conversion to the new type, which is going to be in System.Numerics, which if you scroll down a little bit, it's visible there. And in numerics, we're going to expose ARGB of T and RGBA of T, which are the two most common common types. Those just dictate the order. They allow you to pass in what the T is going to be, much like vector of T and some of the other vector types. We likely limit this to primitive types. Byte and float are the most byte, float, and int uint are the most interesting, but any primitive type is really valid here. And it provides the core interchange ability with the ability to extend it in the future with some of the other helper APIs that are commonly exposed by the by similar numerics and graphics related color types.
I mean, it seems reasonable to me. I mean, the namespace is a bit funky, but I can't think of anything better either.
Yeah. In particular, numerics is likely the right place because the types we expose in numerics today, so vector 2, 3, 4, quaternion, plane, matrix, etc., they're all graphics oriented numerics types. It's basically all those types are basically just the vector math library taken from X and A. And color is notably the missing type from that set that was never ported. So it fits thematically with the other APIs there.
Yeah, the only other alternative might be system formats.colors, but then that might be promising way too much.
Yeah, and then we'd in CoreLib we'd have a namespace with a single member in it. And where it's completely separate from where all the other graphics related numeric SIMD acceleration is.
But so I didn't follow. What do you mean by
that? So for this to be SIMD accelerated, which we're going to SIMD accelerate it in a couple cases, it needs to be in CoreLib. And so in order for it to be exposed and exposed with the similar types that it's going to be like used and dependent on for layering reasons, numeric is the best place. Otherwise, we're exposing a namespace in CoreLib that has a single member in it, which would be or a single only a few sets of members, these color types.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean that.
And you wouldn't have easy access to the System.Numerics things, which you want to allow conversion to and from, and then drawing might need a new dependency, blah blah blah.
Are we saying just put it straight up in System.Numerics? Or
No,
System.Numerics colors?
In System.Numerics colors, because there's a few color types. There's 2 color types and 4 types total here, and in the future there might be a couple others depending on user requests.
I mean, there's only 12 in System.Numerics today, right?
Yeah. It's pretty small, but I mean, it is. I mean, it kind of makes sense to group it, right? Because it doesn't really simulate it to the other things in drawing. Sorry, in numerics, which is, you know, pretty much what you think of numerics, I think. So I think in subnamespace makes sense. I think there's enough meat here to justify that. I mean, it's a bit weird to think of this as, I guess, numerics, but I think what I like about it is that it kind of scopes the feature, right? We are not going to support like the gazillion color formats that exist out there. We just basically provide numerical building blocks to accelerate the access to the individual members, and that's it. So I think that's a reasonable request. I can't quite talk to the ones in WPF and informs, but I guess they're just conversions, so they make sense, so that we can exchange things.
And for reference, the total set of operations we might support in the future, I just linked in chat. Basically, most other most similar libraries that most libraries that have similar scope goals to what System.Numerics exposes a few core functions, which we might expose in the future on these types for convenience. And it's basically just minimal conversion functions to the quote-unquote core color formats, as well as basic arithmetic operations. And much like other types, they aren't covered here because the core need from WinForms by Jeremy is not operation support, but interchange support initially, much like for like System.Half or other types we exposed. And then we may expose the operations in the future based on availability of the devs working on it.
Makes sense. Anybody has a problem with this? Nobody. Okay, that's a rare moment.
Wraith called out in chat, there's a framework design guidelines book that says ARGB is potentially badly named and it should have been alpha RGB. I personally don't agree. ARGB is the de facto name for this color everywhere. And I think calling it alpha RGB is likely more confusing overall.
Yeah, the reason why it was called in Parameter Design Guidance is that people, because of the capitalization rules that we have, basically people think of this as argument B rather than ARGB, right? So that is what causes the confusion. But I mean, at this point, I think we have shipped this way in V1, and this is how we called it everywhere else. And we already have argb method names all over the place anyways. So I would say this is just consistency with what we already have. I'm okay with argb.
And we would never name argument B argb, would we?
No, but like again,
type?
if you assume you don't have any context, you just open up IntelliSense and it says, you know, color from argb, right? You might be. Like some people gave us the feedback that they were confused by this, right? But I think these types are also not mainline types, right? They're clearly designed for people that want to accelerate stuff. So probably these people know what RGBA is or ARGB. All right, then this is it. Can't believe I'm posting looks good as proposed. API this large, but but it is. All right.
You do that a lot for my APIs. I like to think that it's because I've thought them out a lot, and not because no one wants to say it's bad.
Well, it's kind of the old wisdom that what was it again? Like the Forgot the guy's name, but basically he said like when you submit a 2-line PR feedback, like PR, you get, you know, pages worth of feedback. But if you submit pages worth of PR, you get 2 lines worth of feedback. I think it's the same with your API proposals because they're always like humongously large. So who has context on this?
Ping Steve Harder up.
Or Laomi for that matter. So is the JSON DOM? Oh yeah, it's mutable.
Yeah, JSON Node is the mutable one.
Huh.
Steve's here now.
Hello.
Hey Steve. We're looking at your issue, 56592.
Yeah, it's basically just a set of asks by the community. Most of them are kind of independent from each other, but it's just utility methods basically that allow you to do more with JSON Node. You want me to walk through some of these, or how do you want to do this?
Yeah, I guess it would help to just motivate them. I mean, there's some commentary that you have there. If there's anything you want to say on top of that.
Yep. Okay. I mean, I can start with deep clone and then deep equals. Yeah. So again, this is a request by the community to do a deep clone or deep equals, which means do the full traversal. And I have some comments here around edit mode because JSON Node is typically backed by a JSON element, but in edit mode, it can be backed by essentially any CLR type. And assuming we want to support these methods in edit mode, then they become expensive to call. So there's just a little caveat there. If it's in read mode, it's very efficient. Does that make sense? And by the way, Newtonsoft has the equivalent, I think, of all of these. So people coming from Newtonsoft were looking for these.
So I just looked at what we did in X document because that has kind of the same layer, I guess, as this one here. And it seems in X document we do have a deep equals method, but we do not have a deep clone method. Instead, we basically just tell people like new up an X element and pass in the old X element. And then that's basically doing the copy. So basically we only have a copy constructor method. Which seems reasonable as an approach too, right? But I'm not opposed to deep clone. I would generally say that to me at least it seems a bit more discoverable than the constructor.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess if there's a flavor or a preferred flavor of the API, you know, I'll pick whatever.
I mean, we hate iClonable mostly because it's unspecified what you get. So it's very hard to code against the interface, but I think clone or deep clone methods on a particular type with a particular signature makes sense because it's like, well, it does what it does, and then the return type tells you what it gives you back. So, I mean, if you say something is called deep clone and gives you back a JSON node, I mean, there really shouldn't be any confusion of what this thing does.
Mm-hmm. And just a little note here that it does not do the static tool to support null. So of course, assumes you already have a non-null JSON node instance, which is maybe a little bit inconsistent with the other one, but it's shouldn't really hurt usability.
I mean, it generally makes sense to support nullable for equals operations, right? Because that's.
But for deep clone, I'm saying it doesn't support nullable. I mean, you have to have an instance of JSON node to call deep clone. You can't.
Oh, I see what you're saying. If you call it on null, then you just get back in
Right.
its exception. Yes, that is true. I guess that is where the constructor wouldn't help you there either, right? Because the problem with the constructor is now you have an object that is empty, which is not the same as null. So arguably that's actually worse than the null reference exception.
Okay, is everyone okay with these? Should we move on? Or do you want to talk more about the constructor versus the
No, I think
method?
the first two make sense to me. Like the is root one, I'm like, what is how is this, like, why do you need this, I guess is my question.
Yeah, so there's an existing property called root, and it does not return null if you're the root. So it returns the current object. So when people want to know if the current node is a root, they basically have to say if node.root equals node. It's just a convenience wrapper. It's a one-liner. I mean, it's totally optional, but people had questions around it. So
That's interesting. And we don't have parent, right?
no, we do have parent.
Because normally I would just check whether parent is null. That seems more intuitive than comparing root to itself.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that. I'm not sure why I have that sample for node.root equals node when, you know, if you can say node.parent equals null instead.
I mean, if it's literally just doing that, then I don't think we need it. But if the only way to do it right now is via this comparison you wrote here, I understand why people would want something a little bit more readable. This does not seem obvious. I mean, it's obvious once you start thinking about it, but.
Okay. Yeah, let me open up the code real quick here just to get 30. Yeah, parent null check works as well. So this would be a third way, I guess, to figure it out. So maybe it makes sense not to add it.
Yeah, I mean, comparing the parent to null seems the most intuitive way to figure out whether something is a root element. I don't think we need is root.
Yeah, I agree. I after thinking about your parent comment, I'll have to dig up the original comment and see why people asked for it. But okay, so moving on, get value kind. This is a little odd one here, and it wasn't originally added. It was discussed, however. We have this enum JSON value kind, which is used by JSON element. It returns like, you know, is it a number or a string, that sort of thing. And because people interact with JSON node and JSON element, the request was to return this. However, in edit mode, it becomes nonsensical in a way, because if you have just say a random CLR type, you don't necessarily know how that's going to map to a value kind. I mean, we could start special case and things. A string will probably be a string, you know, an int will be a number, that sort of thing. But an object, CLR object, may be serialized as a number, that sort of thing. So anyway, I propose that if we add it, we either in read mode it's obvious because this is backed by JSON element and we map right to it one-to-one. In edit mode, we either throw an exception or we return undefined. If we even add this method, like I said, people ask for it. Otherwise, they're writing their own little helper methods to do whatever. Probably in most cases, going to be backed by JSON element, so they're just writing wrapper methods that get the element out and then call value kind on the element. If assuming it's backed by an element, of course.
When you say in read mode, like I thought the DOM is always like read write. Can you create a DOM that is only readable?
No. What I mean by that, yeah, it's kind of some lingo here. What I mean is that when you do a parse or a deserialize, basically, you get a DOM. It's editable, but it's in this native format. It's just backed by a single JSON element to start out with. So as you start modifying the DOM and adding things to it and that sort of thing and changing values, then it moves into a quote unquote edit mode and discards the original JSON element and then replaces that with the objects that are passed in. So yeah, it's always in edit mode in a way, but it always supports edit mode. It's not in edit mode until you start changing the DOM.
So I guess what does this like? What do I do with this JSON value kind that you return then?
I think the community was asking. They're basically writing lower level code that's utility methods and things like that, and they just want to walk the graph and perhaps see how the nodes translate into JSON. JSON element of course has this property, and in read mode, the node essentially every node in the DOM maps to a JSON element. So they just wanted to get that out easily.
There's no kind property basically on the node today. You basically have to check whether something is a JSON object or a JSON value, and then if it's a JSON value, you have to check, okay, what kind of value is it to actually get the value out.
Right.
Gotcha.
If you know it's in read mode, you just ask for the element and then do whatever you want. If it's not, you have to, you can tell if it's an array, an object, or a value. And so if it's an array, of course, it's going to be an array. If it's an object, it's going to be an object. But value is the tricky one. It can hold it. Like for example, if you want to put a system.double into it, you just add an instance of system.double, and JSON value kind should return number at that point, but it doesn't today because in theory double could be saved as a string or whatever, serialized as a string, that sort of thing. So in either case, in edit mode, it's not so obvious.
But why would it be undefined? I mean, we could just return a sensible value, right?
Yeah, that's where the special mapping comes in. I mean, we can certainly loop through and say for the known types, number types, for example, that we know about, we could return number, but if it's not a known type, we still have to fall back and say undefined at some level. So we can hard code the common values if we want.
Well, wouldn't it just be object at that point? Or string?
I mean, if you have a value, a numeric value that you assign that's not supported or that we don't know about because we don't even own the type, but it's serialized normally as a JSON number, then we would return object, which isn't.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So you're basically saying a JSON value can hold an arbitrary object,
right?
And then when you serialize it, then the user gets to plug in their own serializers, and they could write it in whatever format they wanted.
Right, and just to clarify, JSON value normally contains primitive values. I mean, that's expected, but we don't do any kind of checks, and we purposely allow you to assign any CLR object, including another array or another object to that. And then when it's serialized, of course, it gets normalized to JSON, that sort of thing. And the reason why we do that is just so you don't have to basically do an extra serialize to convert that object to JSON, and then perhaps another deserialize into the node type just to get that thing serialized. So yeah, JSON value can contain in edit mode only, can contain arbitrary values.
In that case, it makes sense. I think in that case, I think it would make sense that the method would say, hey, I try my very best based on whether I understand the type to give you a sensible value back, and if I can't, then I fall back to undefined. I mean, that's the best you can do.
Yeah, and yep. So are you proposing that for like the normal number types, we try to return the right thing?
I mean, that would make intuitive sense, right? I mean, I think it would depend. Did you take the JSON serializer options? I would expect. I mean, I forgot what the property is, but we have a way to treat strings as numbers, right? And vice versa, right? So I would assume that if you have a number and you set the value, you set that option, that we would give you back the value string, right? Because we say, oh, we would serialize it out as a JSON.
Yeah, and to be fair, people weren't asking about edit mode in this particular scenario, so the semantics weren't really defined ahead of time. The simplest thing is to do what I said here, but probably, yeah, the more intuitive approach might be for the known types, strings and numbers, basically return the equivalent JSON value kind, and then undefined for everything else.
Yeah, I think always doing undefined as soon as the thing was modified is probably not great, because I think the idea of the type was that we transparently change from the JSON element to something else when you start modifying it, and it seems desirable that we can preserve most of the behavior if you do that. I mean, of course, once you now start putting stuff in that doesn't have a canonical mapping to JSON anymore, yeah, it's reasonable to say now it's undefined because you're off the well-defined path, right? But if you just modify the string to some other string, or you modified a number to some other number, it seems weird that we would suddenly return undefined, right?
Yep, that's fair. I mean, I agree with that now after walking through it. In fact, there is we already do this in a way. When you call get value on a value node, and you pass in a system.double type as a T type generic, it's a generic method. In either case, we will convert the underlying element. We notice the number, and we'll call get double on that JSON element. So we kind of do this auto mapping of known types anyway. So maybe you can think about this as just extending that. Okay, so I can change a comment on here and clarify that then after this meeting. But the API itself would still be the same, I think. I'm not sure if we need the options.
I mean, I think you do, right? Depending on how people serialize numbers, right? Don't we have the setting that says serialize them as strings?
Yeah, that's probably why it was added. It's okay, so I'm gonna look up this one and see what the original request was, and to see if we need the options.
Makes sense.
If we're just returning undefined for any non-obvious cases, it seems like we wouldn't need the options. Okay, yeah, so I get a little bit of homework on that one, and then for the next one, get property name.
Yep. This
is just a request from people, I think, trying to write their own utility methods, and they're trying to figure out where they came from. We have this. We already kind of do this with the path property. You can ask for the JSON path, and so anyway, this information is easily available. We just don't expose a way for people to get this.
So how would I do this today? I would basically have to go to the JSON, the parent, cast it to JSON object, and then iterating over all the
Right.
objects, over all the, I guess, elements, whatever it's called in JSON object, and then compare them, and then once I have it, then
Right.
access the property name.
Yep, and the same for get element index is the same thing. Really, what I think get property name and get element index, why people wanted those is because they wanted to do a replace semantics, which is the next one. So I think ultimately those two are needed for replace. So the idea was we'll just expose them in case people need them outside of a replace. Because today if you call there's no replace method. So if you wanted to update an object or a property on an object or an element in an array, you would have to do what you said earlier, is ask for the parent, loop through it until you find the one with the reference equals, then call remove on it, or in the case of the array, overwrite it. Remove plus add, I guess, for the object case.
And replace makes sense when you pass in, let's say, a JSON object or a JSON value directly. You do the right thing.
Can you clarify that? I'm looking at the
when you, let's say the JSON node you're standing on is actually just a JSON value. You know, presumably I can replace it with whatever the value is.
Oh,
right?
I see.
42.
I see.
I can also say new JSON value of 42.
Right. That makes sense. I don't clarify that here, but that definitely makes sense. Normally, I think replace would be called on the object array, but
right.
I mean, sorry. But yeah. So yeah, you'd go down to the element you want, which can be a JSON value, and then you call replace, and it'll walk up to the parent and update it. This honestly, this replace method is the big. What is the biggest ask? This is something that people could nicely work around.
Yeah. So in X document, I think it's called replace with, and it takes object or object array, but I think having it off T makes sense, but we should probably just keep it also replace with.
Okay.
If somebody has an objection to that. I guess replace with kind of makes it very, very clear that this is an, other than giving back something. But
that's true. Yeah.
when you return void, so I think it's hard to misuse.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could think about it and say, oh, I'm trying to replace this value. I mean, instead of here's the new value, like here's the old value, or something like that. If you do replace with, it implies that T is the new value. Although I don't think anyone would be confused over that, but. Okay, replace with, I'm fine with that. And for the JSON array one, can you scroll down a little bit?
Yep. Oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong screen. Yep.
Yeah, so if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's just basically a before and after. Just avoids some ugliness. And this was directly requested by the community. I mean, essentially, before and after are from the community members. So. Today, you basically have to cast the value or ask for only, in this case, integers.
Because we don't give you the raw values, we give you just the wrap JSON elements or the JSON nodes,
right.
I guess. Yeah.
Right. In this case, it'd be a JSON value, but that's why the before is kind of get value of int.
So what happens when you call it with the wrong type? It just blows up with embedded operation exception, or?
I think so. Yeah.
When I say get values of object, what do I get back? Do I get back the box versions or do I get back the JSON node?
Get values of you mean just get values?
Yeah, if I basically instantiate the T with object.
Oh, okay, okay. I think that's a good question. I think what you'd want is, I think you'd just get the JSON node back. But I mean, it depends if we think that's a special thing and you want a box value back, if it's a primitive or not.
Yeah,
because we don't know, we
useful.
can't really return the primitive value back because we don't know what you want, right? Like for example, if you in JSON, if you're backed by this JSON array here, 1, 2, whatever the sample shows, those are primitives. Okay, maybe it makes sense. But if that's a JSON element where you just was backed by raw JSON and you still had those literal values 1, 2, 3, 2, we don't know whether those are integers or longs or decimals or what I mean. It could be any kind of number. So get values of object when you're backed by a JSON element you wouldn't be able to pick a type for it. So you just have to return the JSON element boxed value. Basically, just return the internal representation, whatever that happens to be.
Yeah.
Which I think is what we do today when you call get value. If you don't know the value that's held by JSON value, you can pass in object as the type of T, and we just return you what the primitive value is, whether it's JSON element or an integer or something else.
Makes sense to me. Then this is all I have. Anything missing?
I'll follow up on whether the options is necessary for get value kind, and then update the comments that we talked about. And then I guess if the options are not required, make sense we could do that over email or something.
Yep, that makes sense. All right. There's no dissenting voices here.
Okay, thank you.
Alrighty. Anybody talk to this one? I think Miriam dropped off. Nobody can talk to that. Maybe we can skip it. Anybody context on this? Otherwise, we can also just adjourn because I did not update the invite to include all the other ones for new issues. I just conservatively assume we can only get through 5.
There's a stopwatch one a few down that Steven and I could cover.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, so stopwatch today, there's sort of 2 modes for interacting with it. One is you create a new stopwatch instance and you call stop and start on it. Or it also exposes this get timestamp method, which returns a long and is sort of the allocation-free mechanism for interacting with it. Trouble is, you get back that log and then you kind of have to know what to do with it. Typically, what one does is you take a starting timestamp and an ending timestamp. You subtract them, and then you need to figure out the conversion to get from there to a timestamp. And so since Stopwatch is already exposing that get timestamp, and it's pretty common to do this conversion, we're suggesting we basically just expose these helpers. Get elapsed time. You either give it both the starting and the ending, and it does the math for you, or you just give it the starting and it uses the current get elapsed time to give you the elapsed. I went through and I looked at all of our, there's probably a dozen or so places around .NET Runtime where we'd use this, including a bunch of places where we created our own little struct value stopwatch, and they're all replaceable with just this method.
And get timespan already exists, right?
Yeah, timestamp already exists, yeah.
A bit unfortunate it returns a long, but I guess. Yeah. I mean, we could have a new method called getStart that basically gives you a time span, right? That would also work, presumably, right? Or is time span not granular enough?
Yeah, I mean, the alternative would be get time span, I guess, instead of get timestamp or something. And then you have your two time spans and you subtract them. It's a little weird to get a time span that represents a moment in time.
Yeah, I guess that's fair too.
Yeah, with the way the static APIs work, I think it's much more logical and intuitive to just get the long timestamp and then pass in both of them to get the elapsed amount. It's basically the natural way you'd use this API yourself if you were exclusively using the static APIs. So it's a helper on top that covers the
we have
thing everyone else
3 or
needs to do.
4 occurrences of this method in various libraries, because you don't want the long expression at your call site, so you write the little helper to do it, and then we just delete all those and use this one instead.
Yeah, seems good. Since nobody said otherwise. All right. Anything else?
One more that's not marked ready, but I could use some feedback on how folks think we should proceed with it.
Sure.
If you just search for string syntax as one word. Yeah, that one. So scroll down towards the bottom. I have a reply somewhere. That one right there. So as folks will remember, we recently added this string syntax attribute to the runtime. We added a few named constants to it, regex, date time format, and JSON. We'd also sort of tentatively approved XML if we ever had a need for it. There was a request for adding more. And I basically went through all the languages that we sort of quote languages that we have, in our own internal APIs. And this was the list that I came up with for other things that I would think make sense. Beyond this, there's also a debate about SQL and a debate about C# and Visual Basic. I didn't include those. There was also Martin's original issue here. He opened this. He'd also suggested base 64, and I had some thoughts on why I didn't think that was a great idea. So that's sort of the extent of all the ones that we've talked about. So I guess my question is, do we think this is worthwhile in general to sort of expand? I have if you click on the commit that's there, you can see I went through and I basically annotated all of our libraries to see where we would end up using these things. So folks can sort of peruse it, but there's a lot of places where these actually show up. And so if and when Roslyn were to add support for them, they would light up in a whole bunch of places. So from my perspective, it seems like a valuable thing to go and expand upon. Even if Visual Studio, or Roslyn doesn't yet have support for these, and they could trickle in support over time. We could also write analyzers if we wanted to, validate format and stuff. Any thoughts in general?
I think I'm very supportive. I mean, I think that's originally, I think Cyrus suggested the numerical, the datetime formats, for example. And I think it makes perfect sense to at least represent the, as you said, the mini languages that we have in the BCL. Especially because, as you said, we sprinkle them over a gazillion methods, so it would certainly simplify tooling if they don't have to know each and every API and they just light up on the attribute.
Okay. All right. I will go through and validate the list, and then I'll mark the ones that I have as ready for review, and then we can figure out the remaining. There's an ongoing debate about SQL, which I'll leave to Shai and others to come up with an answer for.
Right.
Yeah, I have one issue. If we can review it, it shouldn't take long.
Yeah, and then I've got 3 that we could cover. 2 of them are my area, and one's a compiler, one which I've pinged Fred on, but I'm confident we could get through even without someone from the compiler team.
Tarek, which one is yours?
Yeah, I put it in the chat if you can click on it. It's 65660. Yeah, this one. Yeah, so for this one, when we expose the APIs for activity source to create a new activity, one of the parameters that we pass there is, we call it the parent, the activity context parent, which includes the context of the parent that creating this activity. This parent, have trace ID or span ID and state and flags. And we use this data to create the new activity. I mean, we use the trace ID and we use the state and so on. Part of this parent context also, it has something called is remote or not. I mean, if this context is coming from the remote place, I mean, like over the wire, or it's just created locally. And today, after we create the new activity from this, I mean, we lose this information. I mean, we don't store it anywhere if the parent is created from remote or not. And it happens that in OpenTelemetry, they need to have this information to do sampling there. So the proposal here is just adding to the activity this property is called has remote parent, to telling about if the parent that created this activity is remote or not.
How is this different from adding is remote directly on activity, and people would just say activity.parent.isRemote?
Okay, so because you don't have activity class, activity object for the parent. So the parent is just activity context, which is kind of a struct having some four fields or something like this. It's not an object. I mean, the parent is not an object at that time.
I see. Yeah, I mean, it seems reasonable. Pretty straightforward.
Yes.
Anybody dissenting on this one? Like it? All right.
Thank you.
All right, Tana, what is yours?
So I posted 3 of them in chat. 57881 is the first. Okay. So for this one, it's basically add a try format API that's generic. I already did the necessary due diligence to confirm with Jan that this is okay, and that he thinks that it's an okay idea, which he commented further down below. That was largely the largest blocker from my end. So this, much like the other generic methods that have been slowly exposed on enum, will just allow faster and non-boxing implementation of try format.
Isn't that what ispan formatable is today?
So there's ispan formatable, but it's not implemented and it's not generic.
We could add ispan formatable to enum, but just as we have to do magic in the JIT to make toString work well without boxing, we'd have to do similar magic for ispan formatable.try format.
Yeah, I guess it seems weird that we would have a static helper that, but then you can't actually have a generic method that constrains the T to ispan formatable, right?
Yeah. The comment from Jan was basically we could also expose the ispan formatable, but we'd have to depend on the JIT to eliminate boxing, which makes it an unreliable optimization that depends on the JIT, it not running out of optimization budget, etc. So we could add it for parity, but most users, unless they're in a context with an interface, should realistically be using the generic API here.
And that's not entirely true in that all the places where we rely on composite formatting, like string interpolation, like if you were to pass in an enum into one of your holes, and if it implemented ispan formatable, like that will light up. That would light up string interpolation, and you would just get, allocation-free formatting of your enum values. Where today you get that only if enum's toString doesn't have to do anything fancy like flags or anything.
Even
So-
with string interpolation, if it's ispan formatable, you still get the box, and it's up to the JIT to eliminate that box because it has to go down to enum rather than being the actual enum type.
That's why I'm saying I was responding to your comment that most developers should do this directly, and I'm saying string interpolation is a key consumer of this that would be relying on ispan formatable.
Okay.
I mean, we could do both, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with having a static helper as well.
No, static helper's fine.
Yeah, I think both would be what we'd want to do, and otherwise just the unallocating one.
So then, unless there's pushback, I would just suggest we add the ispan formatable. Hopefully it doesn't conflict, but it shouldn't. Did I miss anything?
Okay, why is there? What's the instance method there?
Well, that's the implementation of ISPAN formatable. Right.
But
I mean, in principle, we could make it.
I don't think we should add that until we're prepared to do the work to make it work well.
Yeah, that was my question. I mean, like, do we want to do both, or do we just want to do the static and say, you know, investigate? That's also fine. I thought the conclusion was that we wanted both.
I would be fine with both, but if we're going to do the ISPAN formatable, we need to do it right.
Yeah.
That.
Could we say the ISPAN formatable is approved, but depends on it being correctly optimized by the JIT at the same time as its implementation? That way we don't need to take it back to API review, and it becomes a whenever someone is available to do that work, they can.
Fine by me.
Yep. Yep, that would work. All right. Alrighty, next one.
Right. So decimal carries a few different internal properties, effectively, that tell you relevant information about it. One of those is effectively the scale, which tells you how many effectively how many how many fractional versus integral digits there are. And that can be useful information to know in various cases. So the proposal is effectively just to expose the internal field. That way you can easily get the info out.
What do you do with that information?
There's lots of stuff you can do with it, including understanding scales, optimizations around how arithmetic works in comparison to other decimal numbers, etc.
What is the maximum of the scale can be?
29. There are 29 significant digits in decimal, and it can you can have your integer and fractional digits split up between those 29 in any fashion.
Still, you're wasting an entire byte.
We can use it for other APIs if we need.
So apparently that will be the first property on decimal. Interestingly enough, but I guess everything else seems to be methods, but I guess everything else is expensive.
Yeah, notably, we already expose this information per se. Like we have a constructor that allows you to pass in the scale and other bits, and we have a method that allows you to extract all the bits together. This would be a way to get just the scale if you wanted it. That way you can that way you don't also have to get the mantissa and the other bits and all the complications of extracting the other 96 bits that you'd need. So it's a lot more efficient.
So basically, get bits, you would have to parse it out yourself then, right?
Yeah, you'd get the bits, and then you have to parse out the relevant eight bits from that yourself, and then mask it correctly, and it's a pain.
Yeah, that makes. I mean, personally, I don't care for a property or method. Either one would probably be fine.
In this case, it's super cheap, so I think property makes sense.
Somebody has an objection to that. So.
Yeah. Notably, Wraith asked why no one has wanted the scale in the last 20 years, and it's no one's opened the API proposal for it. Lots of people have wanted scale and used it for various things, and that's why we expose the ability to construct decimal using a scale and to get the underlying bits and such. This is just a request to make it easier to get just the scale out. Otherwise, you end up with getting out 5 fields all at once, and most of the time you don't need all 5 fields. You're just interested in the scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think the larger point is also the first time as of a few years ago that we started to really go into the long tail of perf optimizations and more efficiency in APIs. I would not hold this against this API. All right.
All right, and this one's pretty straightforward. It's an ask from the compiler team. Basically, with span, the way they made that work was using the obsolete attribute rather than using a mod rec or a mod opt or anything else. And they did this because there were known languages like F#, which at the time didn't correctly respect mod recs. And it was very, very important for something like span, which was built throughout the entire BCL, to have the relevant support. There's additional features that they may be having or implementing in the future, which likewise require similar functionality. It's very important for the ecosystem to understand it. However, they don't want to use modrec or modopt because it can be semi-broken, and because adding a modrec onto an existing signature is a breaking change. So the proposal is to use a combination of obsolete and this new attribute to effectively solve the issue moving forward. Obsolete on older compilers would continue working exactly as it does today, but this new attribute solves a general issue of what if I have something that should only be respected by my language? It's only important to my language and not necessarily to other languages like VB or F#. And also solves the issue of a user who slaps an obsolete attribute on their own type overrides the obsolete attribute that the compiler would otherwise insert. So if you were to go and put an obsolete attribute on your own ref struct, for example, then you don't get the normal ref struct obsolete attribute.
So I think this makes sense to me, except for the part where there's an optional language.
Yeah, the language is specifically for features which are only semantically relevant to a particular language. So if you have no language, if the language is null, then it's effectively equivalent to a modrec. Every language should understand this or should not support the type. If a specific language is listed, or a specific string is listed for the language, then it's equivalent to a mod opt. And only the language that is listed in there, or languages that want to interop with it, etc., need to understand what this compiler feature attribute is.
Yeah, I guess what I'm lacking is an example. Like, it seems, because basically you're annotating an API, right? So if I don't understand the feature, then either I can use the API or I cannot use the API, right? That's basically mod rec versus mod opt. But why is it relevant for whether I am part of that same language ecosystem?
Because there's cases where you can correctly, so take for an example, read-only or even volatile. With volatile, you can correctly use a volatile field anywhere, and you don't have to understand it. It's supposed to just work. However, if you're inheriting from something that's volatile, then it's important for the inheriting thing to understand the constraint, or they're going to do it incorrectly. And so you might have something that is a effectively a mod opt in most cases, but in inheritance scenarios, it's a mod rec.
Okay, but that's also an example where the language is actually relevant, right? Because I can inherit from any language. It's not constrained to just C#, right?
Right. And so in the inheritance scenario, you would have null language. Whereas for the other scenarios, you might just put C# and say it's only relevant that C# understands the semantics. Anyone else can consume the type even if they don't necessarily understand exactly what it means. C++ CLI uses this uses mod opt itself for things like is const and things like that, where the actual semantic of passing in a parameter that's const isn't important. But if you're inheriting from that const, then it is important, and so there's two different distinctions there.
Yeah, I guess to me it's not clear how this will be applied in practice, because I mean you can't really apply the attribute just to this inheritance scenario, right? You have to apply it to the, you know, the actual type or the constructor or something. Seems you can't actually express the thing you want to express at that point. But I mean, it still seems odd that we would say that optionality is now meaning constrained to this one language.
Well, that's the same. Like, I don't personally have an example. And Fred didn't respond to the ping, but
Yeah.
it's the same general concept of mod rec versus mod opt, which we built into the BCL and various languages do extensively use because it's relevant depending on use case.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, right? I mean, I would have understood if you would have had two attributes, right? One is compiler feature required and compiler feature, I don't know, optional, or just an, you know, is optional property on the attribute, right? But it just seems odd to tie the optionality to, are you a member of the same language? Yeah. Because I mean, in generally speaking, you know, for most features, you know, there is a multi-language facet, right? Some languages, you know, support them, some don't, right? But, you know, it seems we want to have this, you know, buffet model where we can say, oh yeah, if the feature is relevant enough, then we add it to F# or maybe even to VB, right? So it would seem that, you know, if we now apply language attributes to those things and then later on we want to support them, then we're now in this weird world where F# says, oh, if you have a language C# and the feature name is X, then I still honor it, right? It seems like a
well, the feature, the feature and the design and interoperability with it is from the original language that implemented it. And so ultimately, if C# implements it first, or implements a different design, then it's C# specific. And if F# went to go support it later, even though F# supports it, it's still not an F# defined functionality per se. It's a C# design functionality that F# happens to support. And so even though F# supports it, you wouldn't go back and add F# to the language or anything later. You'd still keep it as C# because C# was the original designer and the sole decider on what the rules for that are. If F# goes and does its own thing, then they are a separate language entry with different API rules, and C# wouldn't want to be able to interop with something that had the same feature name but the different language.
I suppose. I mean, like, it's still not entirely clear what this means in the long run, though, right? Because if we say, when we take the ref struct example, right? Let's say we add support to define ref structs in, let's say, VB, right? Would then the VB codegen apply the attribute adding the, you know, I mean, in this example, there's no language entry for C#, right? But I mean, presumably, if we would add this feature as it is right now to, let's say, VB, the expectation is that VB would also apply the attribute with the same string, right? So now for optional features that start optional and then other languages add, well, would they now also emit it with the original language, or would they emit it with their own language? Would they emit both? Like, this is where I struggle with the, you know, somebody starts somewhere and then other languages follow. Like, what are the rules for what we want their codegen to do, right?
Yeah. I think Fred would probably have to comment on what that exact scenario is with an example.
And then based on what you said, it seems we are like they would still emit the obsolete as well, just to poison it for the old compilers that didn't know about this attribute.
Right. You still have to omit the obsolete to poison like the native C# compiler, for example. The new attribute is just for features moving forward, so that starting with, let's say, C# 11, it can correctly understand the semantics here.
But I mean, it would still mean that, let's say there's a new feature, right, that is similar to ref structs, as in it doesn't require changes in the metadata, mod regs, mod ops are not applicable, then we would still obsolete and compiler feature require it, right? So that means they would always come in pairs, right? They would never get rid of the obsolete hack.
Right, you always do in pairs, so you poison the old compiler, and so that you remove, and then this attributes to remove the limitations of the existing of using obsolete.
So is it then fair to say that the primary use case for this is really just documented in a more straightforward fashion rather than this obsolete hack? But technically, the obsolete hack doesn't disappear with this feature.
Right, and it fixes the issue where the user adding their own obsolete attribute has to override overrides the compiler defined obsolete attribute.
So the last part I didn't understand. What do you mean by that?
If a user, Fred described the scenario below. If a user adds an obsolete attribute on their type, then it overrides the one the compiler would otherwise implicitly emit. That's the way it works today.
Gotcha. Yeah, the only way to fix that would be to support more than one obsolete. And then just say the compiler has to just filter out the one that it generated.
Yeah.
Which wouldn't be horrible necessarily.
I think there'd be I think that older compilers may also get tripped up on that. Because they rely on obsolete to surface errors.
Okay, so then I guess we mark it as needs work and let them respond to that.
Yeah, so basically it's just it generally looks good, but we need a scenario explaining the and showing the language usage, and then it can come back and likely just get final sign off.
Yeah, that would be my position. I mean, I think we asked for this multiple times, right? So I think it's the sorry, that's the wrong label. There's no way this will confuse my tool. So I'm very happy that we go down this direction. We need to clarify what the semantics are for the languages, I think. We have 10 more minutes, unless there's more. We can also wrap up early.
There's one from Jared, but Jared says he wants to be here to review it, so we shouldn't look at it. And I don't have anything else in my areas.
All right, then let's call it a day then. Thanks, everyone.